I became fascinated when I connected the dots with the idea that the buildings we live and work in can make you sick. That to me was a mind-blowing idea. It was just I always thought about these buildings as like these just static boxes that we live and work in that
Yeah,
protect us from
never
the
think
elements
about
and
it.
whatever. Never thought that they would actually have an impact on our health or longevity, but in fact they do.
Welcome to the Everyday Epigenetics Raw, Real, Relatable podcast. I'm your host, Susan Robbins, epigenetic human performance coach. This is where we discuss all things lifestyle, environment, food, exercise, work, mind, and social interaction as they pertain to epigenetic expression in a way that's relatable to everyone. So if you're ready to start viewing you as an individual, take control of your life and health, and get results, buckle up, here we go. Welcome to the Everyday Epigenetics Raw, Real, Relatable podcast. I'm your host, Susan Robbins, and this is where we talk about all things lifestyle and environment and how they relate to our genetic expression. And today's topics, sit down, buckle up for this one. This one's going to be a good one. As we sat here chatting, I started getting all excited. I forgot even what I was saying in the intro. So be ready for a good one here. So this is going to be about mold. And we have the mold guy, the guru here, Jason Earle. And I met Jason last month. It was about a month ago down at the, what was it, Hack Your Health conference in Austin, Texas, and loved his story. Got to chatting with him at his booth, and he agreed to come on my podcast. And I'm so very grateful because you are going to love this. So when I'm doing my DNA testing in my toxicants and inflammation panel, we actually have a section that we look at what your propensities are as far as detoxing from mold and what your severity propensities are with exposure to mold. But it's not just about mold. There's so much else that's going on here that we're going to dive into today. But with Jason is a man on a mission, adoring father of 2 boys in diapers, incurable entrepreneur, and indoor air quality crusader. He's the founder and CEO of Got Mold. Remember the old Got Milk campaign? Well, he's Got Mold, and the creator of the Got Mold test kit. The realization that his moldy childhood home was the underlying cause of his extreme allergies and asthma led him into the healthy home business in 2002, leaving behind a successful career on Wall Street. And may I just say that as I delved a little more in, I saw that you were the youngest licensed stockbroker setting a Guinness World Record at 17.
Yeah, fun fact.
Wow. And then over the last 2 decades, Jason's personally performed countless sick building investigations, solving many medical mysteries along the way, helping thousands of families recover their health and peace of mind. He has been featured on or appeared on Good Morning America, Extreme Makeover, Home Edition, The Dr. Oz Show, Entrepreneur, Wired. The list could go on. So I am so very grateful that you took the time to stop on my new podcast and give us some great information. So welcome aboard, Jason Earle.
My pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
So let's start here. I know that I've had mold exposure. I have chronic Lyme and they're co-infections. And I know a lot of people have Lyme also have mold issues. But mold, you don't hear a lot about it, but it seems to be coming more into the mainframe of discussion now. And I'm not sure why that is. So maybe you can shed some light on that. But I'd like to start with your story because I think your story is so interesting. And so if you could begin there, and then we can segue into how you really started becoming the mold crusader.
Sure thing. Thanks again for having me. It was great meeting you at the show, and I'm glad we're making the time to have this conversation because it's an important one. It's also one that, to your point, is mold's in vogue, and there's good news about that, and there's bad news about that, and we can dig into why I'm a little worried about mold being in vogue. There's a lot of people that are getting diagnosed with mold-related illness based upon mycotoxin urine panels, which are wildly prone to false positives. They actually reflect food-based exposure, so we'll unpack that a little bit later. It's very important because a lot of people tear their lives apart because of a mycotoxin urine panel, and then also supporting it with an ERMI test, which is a dust test that's very popular these days too. And those both are wildly prone to false positives. And more importantly, the data is not interpreted correctly. And so therefore, it's not so much the test that's flawed, it's the way it's used. And so there's that. So that's a recent occurrence and is very popular in the functional health space. And that's one of the reasons why it's gaining so much traction, is because there's so much popularity around these particular tests. They're easy, they're inexpensive, and then they validate people's fears. They validate people's concerns. They validate people's symptom profiles. And so people want validation. And so it leads to confirmation bias. And so there's a whole loop there that's worthy of an entire podcast by itself. But the reason I got into this space, decades ago, literally, was due to the awareness, as you mentioned in the intro, that my childhood respiratory illness was actually probably from my moldy home. So when I was 4 years old, I suddenly lost a lot of weight in a 3-week period, and my parents took me to the pediatrician, who said, "Nope, you got to take him to Children's Hospital. This looks pretty serious." And so they initially diagnosed me with cystic fibrosis because of my family history and the symptoms that I was presenting with, which was exactly what my parents were worried about, because my father lost 4 cousins to CF before the age of 14.
Wow.
So this was their nightmare coming true. So they spent 6 weeks crying while they waited for a second opinion, which thankfully liberated us from that diagnosis. In fact, I had asthma compounded by pneumonia. Do not have CF.
So it was CF. Never the CF. Wow.
Never had CF. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So they were greatly relieved, of course. But I ended up getting allergy tests, which of course is, part and parcel to an asthma diagnosis. And it turns out I was allergic to every single thing they tested me for. So the list was very long, but it was like grass, wheat, corn, eggs, dogs, cats, cotton, soybeans. And I grew up on this little non-working farm in Princeton, or outside of Princeton, New Jersey, surrounded by cornfields, soybean fields, dogs, cats, grass, wheat, corn, eggs, all that stuff just in abundance. And so I lived on inhalers. And when my folks split up when I was 12 years old, I moved out of that musty farmhouse, and all my symptoms went away. And it was chalked up to what they call spontaneous adolescent remission, which is a fancy term for we have no idea what the hell happened. And it was also echoed with my grandfather, who grew out of his asthma about the same age. So, it's very common with adolescents anyway. Mm-hmm. And so thank goodness it actually happened then, because, these things can get hardwired into you.
Sure.
And so, I think I was blessed with that change of environment at that age. And by the way, intuitively, I always wanted to be outside. And of course, little kids should and often do want to spend as much time as possible outside. But intuitively, I felt better outside. And I look back at that now, and it's pretty clear. Plus, my parents had a very strange idea about hygiene. The dogs and cats did what they wanted to do in the house. And it was not it wasn't hygiene. It was more like, and so we just
all lived through that back in those days.
Yeah. The 70s parents, man. Who needs seatbelts, Just wipe it off, But what in that same house, though, and this is relevant to the conversation, 2 years later, my mom stayed behind. I moved out and moved in with my dad and his new wife. And 2 years after I moved out, my mother committed suicide in that same house. And that did not connect for me at the time, as it would take these, in retrospect, these things often do make sense. At the time, they're just these, seemingly insurmountable events, but in retrospect, they all seem to connect. And so, and then 2 years after that, or about a year, 18 months after that, I was diagnosed with Lyme disease. Still don't know if I actually had it, but I did go through thermonuclear levels of antibiotics, which wiped out my gut flora and such that I couldn't eat refined carbohydrates. And I ended up going on a keto diet when I was really young. So that probably helped me a lot in lots of ways. Helped me get my brain back, but it also probably helped me detox from the mold exposure, since the ketogenic diet is very helpful for people that are dealing with mold-related illness. And we can talk about that more too. So fast forward, just, skipping over some stuff, but you mentioned my Wall Street background. So I ended up missing a lot of school because of my mom's untimely demise and Lyme disease. And so one day they pulled me in and basically told me that I was going to have to stick around for the rest of the year and then come back and repeat it, because I'd already missed too much school. And I said, that doesn't sound like a really good deal. So how about this? I'm out of here. And so my dad signed me out and went to the gas station, took full-time hours there while I decided I was going to save money and start college a year early. There's no better revenge than massive success. And so before I could even get my GED, I met a guy at the gas station. I fixed his tire and we sparked up an ongoing conversation, and he recruited me to come work for him. And so he was the managing director of a small boutique investment bank. And so I started working for him at 16. And then within a year, I had my stockbroker's license. Wow. And then I did that for 9 years. So I had a nice career. I owned my own firm the last 2 years of it right before the dot-com bubble burst. And at that point, I realized I was doing something that was very good for me financially, but wasn't good for my soul. And my mom had raised me to, I volunteered at the hospital where she worked. And so I did a lot of international volunteer missions for like Operation Smile and stuff when I had free time, which was rare. But that always scratched an itch that I couldn't reach any other way. And so I decided I wanted to go do something meaningful with my life, and I had no idea what that looked like. And so when I went traveling, left Wall Street behind and backpacked around for a while after September 11th. I quit in August, and then September 11th happened. So then I went traveling after that. And while I was away, I happened to be in Hawaii. I was reading a lot of local newspapers. I had some time on my hands, and I read a story about a guy who had developed adult onset asthma, as well as all these allergies that he never had before, and he attributed it to the mold in the hotel where he was an employee. He had a long-term exposure to this mold, and it just was like a deja vu moment for me. It was, it rhymed a lot with my childhood, except it was in reverse. And so I just thought, man, I wonder if we had a mold problem. And knowing nothing about mold, of course we had mold. It's such a damp basement. My mom, there were snakes in our basement sometimes. This is New Jersey. This is not like we're living in the tropics.
Grew up in Jersey myself, but
Did
I was ashore. Yeah, I'm Jersey Shore.
Yeah, no, I was in Mercer County, so right dead center.
West. As soon as you started talking, I was like, East Northeast. It's not New Jersey. So when 100%. You said Jersey, I was like, all right, brother, keep going.
Yep, absolutely. It's good to connect here. Us Jersey people got to stick together.
That's right.
And people don't understand New Jersey. It's disregarded as the armpit of America, but that's only because they base it based upon the New Jersey Turnpike and the Parkway, right? You go a couple miles in, it's gorgeous, horse farms and whatever. But I like it when people don't think that, because maybe it will become less congested. Anyway, yeah. So the whole Wall Street thing, and then this evolution into the mold thing was rather quick, actually. It was, I was gone for, in total, a few months. But when I came back, I hit the ground running. I immediately took a job working for a basement waterproofing company that was doing mold treatments, and saw that they were basically leaving homes worse than they left them, using chemicals instead of cleaning. And there was no standard. There was no industry, really. This is so early on. I had to really educate people around this, and yet the education wasn't available. I was taking classes at night, and I was, cold calling professors that, building science, I taking, auditing classes, because I wasn't, I didn't have a high school diploma, or, I didn't have.
You still didn't at this time. You didn't have.
No,
did you?
No. I ended up getting my GED only because it's a very long story that I won't bore everyone with. But I ended up getting recruited out of a parking garage by a self-made billionaire named Mario Gabelli, and so again, it's another story for another podcast. But he ended up recruiting me to come work for him, and he wanted me to go get this certified financial analyst designation, which required some college. And so I went and got my GED. And it's funny, I went to go stand in line for the GED, and I showed up after work, and I had my briefcase and my suit and my watch, I was dressed like a stockbroker. And in this kid, everyone's looking at me askance. And this one kid next to me mustered up some gumption and looks at me and he goes, "Sir," now keep in mind, I'm like 21, right? He goes, "Sir, I think you're on the wrong line." And I said, "This is for the GED, right?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "No, I'm in the right line." And he goes, "F yeah." Like he was just.
I love it.
So I got that, and I actually wish I didn't. Actually, in a way, the rebel in me would much prefer to have never gotten it. But I have to be honest, my integrity requires it. So So anyway, it basically ended up getting into this space, and there was no real central repository. There were no set training classes there. So it required a level of curiosity that I possessed. And the reason I possessed it because I became fascinated when I connected the dots with the idea that the buildings we live and work in can make you sick. That to me was a mind-blowing idea. It was just I always thought about these buildings as like these just static boxes that we live and work in that protect us from the elements and whatever. Never thought that they would actually have an impact on our health or longevity, but in fact they do. Buildings are an extension of our immune system. They are an exoskin or an exoskeleton, and we have a synergistic and, more importantly, a symbiotic relationship with our buildings. And so, when a building gets sick, the occupants often get sick. And when I say building gets sick, when it's not maintained well, when water starts getting into the walls, right? When it stops doing its primary thing, which is to shed wind and water. That's a building's primary responsibility, is to protect the inhabitants primarily by shedding wind and water. It's that simple. And when it fails to do that, water starts to get into the walls and mold grows very quickly in modern buildings, something we didn't have to deal with before 1945, before the baby boomers caused the demand for faster and cheaper building materials. Sheetrock is the main issue.
Oh, so the sheetrock makes it easier for the mold.
Yeah. Modern buildings grow mold like wildfire because of sheetrock. It's the paper that's on. Yeah. So mold won't grow on old school buildings, right? So plaster, old growth timber, concrete, these kinds of materials don't support fungal growth. Plus, we didn't have fluffy insulation in the walls back in the day. They're hard to heat and cool, but they also didn't have a sponge-like effect. So the water gets in the walls, it stays.
Oh wow! So that also affects it then. Insulation.
Yes, insulation.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So all the things that we do for comfort and convenience, which means to build faster and cheaper buildings. So that's convenience, and then comfort, meaning insulation. Those things, and HVAC systems, this recirculation of air without the introduction of new fresh air. All of these things ultimately have an unintended consequence. It's just, that's life, right? You pull on one string, and next thing you know, it unravels something somewhere else down the way. And so we are basically doing modern construction is a series of building experiments that have stacked up on top of each other and gone terribly wrong. And so, it began with faster, cheaper building materials in post World War II. Then we started, closing up our buildings for energy efficiency in the 70s. And then we started introducing more and more petrochemicals into the materials themselves. So like insulation's got formaldehyde in it. It's a group 1 carcinogen. What the hell are we doing? Doesn't make any sense. Yeah. All the pink and yellow stuff is formaldehyde infused. And so unless you specifically seek out healthy building materials, what's on the shelf is garbage. What's on the shelf is carcinogens and mold food. And I'm not being hyperbolic on this. I tend to, I can be hyperbolic because it's fun and it characterizes the problem in a way that makes it more memorable, but this is not hyperbole. This is an accurate representation, distillation of what's actually gone on in our world right now, our modern world.
If you're putting some of that in your home, you're building a home, remodeling, doing new insulation, there are other options than what from the toxic. They're just not out there.
Yeah, but they're not supported by Lowe's and Home Depot and the big box stores because they're all part of the same sort of, factory model, which is the same reason why our grocery stores are loaded with factory food. Our building material companies are chemical companies that happen to sell materials that we use to build buildings with, and so they are guilty. They're innocent until proven guilty. And so you have to the same thing with look at asbestos, right? Asbestos is overblown. But at the same time, there's harm in that material, but they had to really prove it to get that stuff taken off the market. And we have a lot of mushy science around this stuff because you can't prove human disease easily because you can't test on people. So they hide in this loophole of you can't prove it's bad, but you haven't proven that it's good. And so like that's where we have a problem with our industry when it comes to food and drugs and the pharmaceuticals, the building material companies, the food companies. What they are able to hide in the reality that they have to be proven guilty. And instead of actually proving like they do in Europe, for all the flaws of the EU, they at least have the onus of responsibility fall upon the companies that make and sell the products to prove that it's safe before they go out and sell it. It's the opposite here.
Yeah, I've found the same. And I interviewed a few weeks ago Elizabeth Bolus, who's an expert on different toxins. And we went almost 2 hours. It just blew by talking about all this. And she came from the food industry and was saying all these same things, basically.
It's deplorable. And it's a very obvious thing, too. You hold up food's a great example, but if you hold up Fruit Loops, which is garbage anyway, but you hold up the one in the UK that's on the shelves in the UK, same manufacturer, right? And the one that's on the shelf here, and you look
Totally
at the
different.
colors, one's made from carrots. The one in the UK is natural, literally, and they say it is derived from carrots. And the other one is, red dye and yellow dye, whatever. And that's an American company. We're poisoning our kids, and it's because it's cheaper. There's no other reason that I can see. The only other reasons would be much less benevolent. And so I'd like to at least think that it's a financial motive that's making those decisions. So just circling back really quickly to the reason that this whole thing evolved into how Got Mold evolved is that I quickly saw that the contractors were not doing the right thing. And I realized that there was an opportunity to help protect the consumer, to guide them through the process of navigating the contractors. So mold was one problem. The contractors were at least as big of a problem because, people love to just jump right over. I got a little mold, jump over to the contractor. But, that's like saying, I've got a high cholesterol rating. I've got to go get, open heart surgery. You might want to go to your GP first and get a physical, which is what an inspection is. An inspection is a physical of your building. What is wrong? What are the symptoms? What's the history? The same stuff same questions you answer when you're sitting down with your doctor is the same questions that you should be asked and that you should be answering when you speak to an inspector. How long has the building been here? How long you lived here? How many owners? Have you had any water damage? Is there any musty smells? How's everyone feeling? What are their symptom profiles? You go through a health assessment of the building. And so if you do that, and then you also do proper testing and you do investigative demolition where necessary and all this kind of stuff, then you can actually reduce this remediation job down to a surgical level. And then you can actually save them a lot of money and also help them avoid the contractor who basically gets paid by the pound. They're paid by the square foot. How much are they going to tear out? As much as possible,
Wow.
And so contractors have a conflict in many ways. Their motivation is big, not surgical. And so an inspector doesn't get paid by the pound. They get paid by the value of their advice. And hopefully they don't have a conflict of interest where they're connected to the contractor who's paid by the pound.
I saw that on your website where you're talking about that when you have the test person that comes in, if it's the same as the contractor, there you have a complete conflict of interest and you want to avoid that completely.
You really do. It's like, don't ever ask a barber if you need a haircut. That's a rather benign version of it. But, and if, inspectors they don't get paid that much. It looks expensive, but there's lab fees and there's, time. Plus you have to write the report if you're actually doing the right thing.
Sure.
You end up between the inspection and the travel and everything else, you could be into an inspection 10 hours. You paid a couple $1,000, you're at $100 an hour. It's like really not, no one's getting rich doing that kind of work. But if you're feeding to, your brother-in-law who's got a remediation firm and they're doing, projects 10, 20, 30,000 and hey, you line up a bunch of those and, that doubles your income pretty easily without having to lift a finger. So that's a very common problem. And there's a lot of guys who are just doing it both ways anyway. They're not even passing it off. They're not even hiding it. They're just going to come in and do a free inspection. And then let's see what they find. Chances are they're going to find something.
They're going to find something.
They're going to find something. Don't ask a barber, right? And so you got to watch out for that kind of stuff. And it's hard as you get into rural areas and you get outside of major metropolitan areas to find, because just the density, you're not going to find a lot of people that are qualified to do this kind of work. It's very specialized and very multidisciplinary. So I decided I was going to start an inspection company to help people, but I was doing them basically for free at night while I was working for the remediators. and heard about a guy who trained mold sniffing dogs and thought that was just brilliant enough to work. And so went down to Florida, ended up coming home with one, which was amazing. And she ended up being the secret weapon. She taught me how mold grows in buildings. She taught me where to look. She gave me an education that I could not have gotten from any of the classes I was taking, any of the, no matter what I would have done, she accelerated it. It was like warp speed, university by dog, and she really showed me she showed me so much so fast that I could diagnose a building mostly from the curb
Oh my
based upon the
gosh.
way it was, the type of house, how old it was, the general maintenance of the exterior. You know, I would do a quick assessment on the end. My partner and I would, and my employees and I would place little bets. I bet it's going to be this and this. I got pretty good. And so it was fascinating because we also got a lot of national press out of using the dogs. And so we ended up, with all the media that you mentioned during the intro. And so we never had to advertise. So we just
Wow.
had an onslaught, 30, 40 calls a day, people from
Oh my
all over the
God.
country asking us to help them out. But in recent years, I became frustrated by the fact that most people who need us couldn't afford us. And so that's why I created the Got test kit. So, which we can talk a little bit more about. But really, we're here to talk about everyday epigenetics. And there's a lot here that's emerging. It's a cool space. The idea that our environment can not just make you sick, but it can actually impact your genetic expression. And actually some really cool research that came out in March this year from University of Texas through someone who I hold in the highest esteem, Claudia Miller, shows that not only does it impact your genes, but it can actually impact future generations. And so, there's just a lot to talk about here.
People have no idea. One I did a couple weeks ago was on epigenetics and trauma, or trauma and epigenetics. And again, what happens in this generation affects the next through the womb, whatever. It's all about the adapting of the genes for survival. It's all survival. And you and I were chatting a little bit about this. So I'd love for you to talk more on this about the MCS, which is multi-chemical sensitivities. I see this. So again, I go back. It was interesting. My old company that I used, Appearon Zoe, that's why I got certified to do the DNA. Their main three panels were nutrition, supplementation to micronutrients, and sleep. But as I got into doing more of the DNA and got into looking really more through my own, I thought, sleep, I can pull out a lot of impactful sleep genes out of the food panel. But what about this? And that one was, oh my God, I haven't used that panel in so long because I have my own now, but it's basically my toxicants and inflammation panel now. And I thought, why are we not, with all the shit that we're exposed to, why are we not looking at the propensities of our detox systems and how we can work with that to get them more optimal? Because that toxin bucket, as Elizabeth and I talked about weeks ago, that toxin bucket, it can fill up pretty quickly with all we're exposed to. Like you said, between the food, the building where we live, the chemicals, all the crap in the environment, things we're putting on our skin, breathing in, the scents that, and I said to you earlier, I walked by another condo here, and I can smell the dryer sheets on a hike. Someone walks by me, I smell the dryer sheets when they go by. I'm like, oh, I'm super sensitive, and I'm finding that. But I thought, why are we not doing this panel? The sleep we can work with, but why are we not dialing up this panel to learn how our bodies can work better with this? And so I do the nutrition, micronutrients, and then I do toxicants, inflammation as my base three panels because they all play so well together. What you're eating, working out, the exercise at the right time. That's my other platform. Doing the right things at the right time can be super impactful.
Mm-hmm.
And the right supplements, because there are some wonderful supplements that really can help dial up different parts of your detox systems that might be a little bit suboptimal. And so, yeah, I'd love to talk more about this because I'm seeing so many people, including myself, that are more prone to the chemical sensitivities from a genetic basis. But then when you add in other things like I had seen on your page as well. I did my little research and found it fascinating. Lyme disease, you and I both, right? Lyme disease, that jacks you in so many ways. And then you add MTHFR propensities on there. I'm hit there again. More histamine sensitivity. And then you put all this together. And I just find it so fascinating how many people are hit with it genetically, but even those I'm seeing where I say, "Well, you have a very low propensity for environmental sensitivity." And they're like, "I can't come in contact with anything. I go crazy."
Yep. This is a very common thing now. It used to be very much marginalized, and people with MCS were, considered to be, the crazies. They're the tinfoil cap wearing people, and they're, you know, there's a
Hypochondriacs.
hypochondriacs. And what's fascinating about there's a lot of stuff that's fascinating about that. I've always really related to those people, even though I'm not one of those people. I strongly prefer no fragrances. And by the way, I had a water damage event in my basement, and the guy came in, and I didn't, in a lapse of attention, he ended up dispensing this fragrance, this unbelievable fragrance that overwhelmed my entire house. I agonize over that stuff. No fragrances, no chemicals, nothing in my house. And it was a real event here. The water event was nothing. I know how to manage that. The fragrances, it's almost impossible to get those things out. So we're gonna have to tear that carpet up down in
Oh,
the basement,
wow.
which is, there's no carpet shouldn't be in a basement anyway. So this is one of the things that I always tell people not to do. So, I'm getting into more congruence, but we bought this house 2 years ago. I'm still working on some of that stuff. Nothing's perfect, right? Everything is an
Do the best you
evolution,
can.
right?
Mhm.
But MCS is something that I relate to because I see people and I realize I can recognize a common physiology. There's something, I don't know. This is not science. This is Jason talking about pattern recognition. But I recognize a common physiology, the way that they hold themselves, the general anxiety around this. And in recent years, that has started to actually be explained. And it's fascinating. And it largely probably revolves around something known as cell danger response. And so this is a function of mitochondria. Some people call it a dysfunction. It's not. It's actually the mitochondria doing what they're supposed to do, which is that mitochondria are powerhouses inside of our cells. And by the way, they have different DNA. They're actually your mom's DNA, which is really cool. So everyone's carrying your mom around with you for the rest of your life, and
Like that.
whether you like it or not. And contrary to popular opinion, you can actually have lots of mitochondria in one cell. In fact, a healthy cell does have more than one mitochondria, right? It's a plural thing. And what's fascinating is that mitochondria are the powerhouses of our cells, right? They're the ones that keep the lights on, as well as, regulating lots of different processes. So, but their primary function is to create energy and to dispense it, so to speak. But when things go wrong, and by the way, they're sending out signaling to make sure that the cell walls are permeable, so that there's lots of ion exchange, and there's communication going on, and everything is good, right? A nice state of being is when energy is being produced, and that's when you feel vital and energetic, and things are moving well. But when there's a threat, and this kind of dovetails with Dr. Nasha Winter's philosophy around metabolic terrain. She has the Metabolic Terrain Institute of Health. She's a world-class naturopathic oncologist and a good friend. She talks about the terrain needs to be optimal. So that's your air, food, shelter, relationships. So essentially your environment and all the variables within that space, your thoughts, right? That's your that's your terrain. And if things are off, then you can create an opportunity that's conducive to cancer. So that terrain will support cancerous growth. The similar thing happens at your mitochondrial level, which is where the body perceives, or I should say the mitochondria specifically, because they breathe very fast. So people don't think about mitochondria as breathing, but they respire, right? There's every living cell, every cell. And by the way, mitochondria is a cell within a cell. It's an organism essentially within the cell. And you can look at each cell almost as an organism because it is a system of life-sustaining systems. it cannot survive by itself, but it is in fact all the organelles within it. You can really look at this thing as an individual. So anyway, when the mitochondria senses through its respiration that there's a threat through chemical signaling or sensing an actual chemical threat, it will go into cellular defense mode. Now it can only do energy production or cellular defense. So when it does cellular defense mode, the cell wall becomes less permeable, right? And suddenly it fattens down the hatches. And because it stopped producing energy, we feel fatigue.
So
and then possibly even depression, right? Things like that. But so what causes this? Anxiety of any sort is essentially the body's maladaptive often maladapted way of dealing with fear. And so that's a terrain issue. That's how you're processing your world. And so, but chemical threats are a big one. And so you can have these large exposures, mold exposure, chemical exposure, and they can actually cause you to become sensitized to the other thing. And your body doesn't know the difference between mold-related chemicals, like the musty odor, and man-made chemicals, like the VOCs, or volatile organic compounds that are in our building materials and cleaning products and personal care products and fragrances and all this crap that our world's, soaked in. And so, you can have a big chemical exposure. Next thing you know, you're sensitive to mold. How did that happen? The body is connecting the dots, right? Oh, you can have a big mold exposure and suddenly you're chemically sensitive. This is very common. And so those people are generally regarded at this point to be in cell danger response mode, CDR. And so the way people get out of that, and by the way, there's the CDR, if you look it up, there's all sorts of epigenetic mechanisms within CDR that are being explored right now. So it changes you. Here's the good news. What changes can change again.
That's what I do.
And so that's the good news. Bad news is the tools are not always readily accessible, and you also have and easily accessible. And the thing is, you also have to have your mindset. So this is not just a mechanical function. It is a psychophysiological function. And so notice psycho, mind, physiological, body. It is mind, body.
It always is, Jason.
Always. It's all mind anyway.
Is, right?
It's all really actually there is no physical. There's only mind. If you really want to go down that rabbit hole, there is no physical. There's only mind. But it shows up. Our physical stuff shows up as it's our mind manifest. But we have to deal with this thing, this body that we have created, and all of these switches within it, and navigating this stuff requires, if you want to get over these things, you have to do three things. You have to deal with air, food, and attitude. And so air is essentially chemicals in our buildings, chemicals on us, in us, and around us. So you need to eliminate all of the synthetics stuff, all the fragrances and all the building materials that are off-gassing. So if you're going to renovate, choose wisely. If you're going to build, choose wisely. And these things are abundant. You can look up low VOC, no VOC materials. They're abundant. Go to Green Builder Supplies. There are people there that will help you. No problem. And then you stop spraying things in your house that smell good. Clean doesn't have a smell.
No.
So.
Can you touch really quickly on, because I think this is so important. Like I said to you early on, or when we were talking before we went live, that when I came back from Austin, how I was so sick. And I knew it wasn't all allergies down there. I know I react to some things there, and I have before. But I've been other places where humidity didn't bother me. And Amy had said, I'm telling you, I think there's mold in this hotel. And it was a nice hotel. But it took me, I kept telling people, where the hell is that freaking truck that hit me in Texas? Because it took me almost 2 weeks to feel normal again. My heart rate variability dropped like into the 40s from 60s, like sleep. I couldn't sleep. And then I saw in your symptoms about insomnia. I know my sleep issue, if I have a sleep issue, what it is. But then you were telling me about on the planes and hotels, how these are major places, but it's not necessarily mold. It's the VOCs.
Yeah, it's VOCs and also other compounds that are not regulated, antimicrobials, sanitizing agents became very popular during COVID. Fogs and sprays, a huge business. It went from a big business to a huge business.
Yeah.
And so hotels, airports, public spaces in general, at night or in between when they're cleaning the plane out, there's a lot of stuff used there that you would not put in your Cheerios. You know what I'm saying? Like there's a lot of stuff there that you would not put on your skin, you would not knowingly inhale, that has, very specific guidance on the MSDS sheets, or I'm dating myself
Mhm.
there now, SDS sheets.
Yep.
But these things aren't, and those are also, by the way, those are self-reported on the SDS sheets. Those companies are required to produce them. They're not audited or vetted.
Mm-mm.
You just put whatever you want down. A lot of companies get in trouble for that later on down the road, but a lot of them don't, because a lot of them just never get vetted and never get double checked. So yeah, no, that's why I never take my shoes off or my socks off, especially
In a hotel
in a
room,
hotel room.
I always bring like little
Yeah.
slippers or something to wear so that my feet aren't touching.
It's a good practice, and similarly, never lay on the comforter, to pull that back. So yeah, it's a major problem. And then, by the way, there's also a lot of mold in Austin. At my hotel, which I selected specifically because of the materials that were used in its construction, and it had concrete floors with an area rug and all the things I tell people to do. And they didn't have sheetrock walls. I walked in, I was like, 11 o'clock at night. I'd been on my feet all day, and I smelled that smell, that musty smell. And I want to talk about the musty smell in a minute, but it hit me really hard, and I had to go through a practice where I just affirmed life and nature and my own resilience. And because I called downstairs and they said that they were all sold out and that they couldn't move me. So I said, I'm not going to open the windows. It's superhuman outside.
Yeah.
And, I don't carry a respirator with me. Not that I would go to sleep in that one. That seems a little insane. Might as well wear my tinfoil hat too. But
Instead, and my mouth tape.
Instead, I really worked on getting into a state of, parasympathetic state, where I just, love and acceptance. And, and I taped my mouth, as I often do, especially in situations like that, where I know I actually need the extra filtration, and not that it filters out the gases, but I'm humidifying. And, there's lots of benefits to mouth taping. And if you haven't done it, I highly recommend you try. Yeah. It's a game changer. My wife is skeptical about a lot of stuff. That's what good wives do. And she is now a complete convert after doing it for the last, 6 months or so.
I'm going to do a podcast on it, because I've been doing it for 5 years, and it was the DNA group. We were at an Imperion training, and I was in a group with these 3 guys, and the one said, yeah, my wife snores. My wife snored till I taped her mouth shut. And I go, that's cruel. And he goes, no, seriously. I taped her mouth shut.
That's why I tape her mouth shut. She's a major snorer,
It was a game changer. It improves the nitric oxide production in your nasal cavity. It blew me away. And people say, well, I'm so stuffy, I would die. And I said,
nope.
But it actually helps you. I'm
clears
less
it up.
stuffy with my mouth taped.
Yep.
And I will not. I'm going to do one with the different mouth tapes, because there's all different ones. That's a whole other, like I said, that's a whole other podcast, but someone else who's not crazy, right? We're not crazy.
No, it's not. Actually, and everyone I know that tries
scientifically proven loves
the only objection they often have is the tape itself. And so, what I use is this really nice ouchless surgical tape, or ouchless bandage tape. And I just do the little strip. I don't pay for these crazy, mouth strips and stuff, because you don't need it. You need a tiny little 1 square inch. Just enough to remind you that you're supposed to keep your mouth shut when you sleep and breathe through your nose. And if anybody wants to read about this, go get Breath by James Nestor. It's a fabulous book on like 100 levels. Entertaining. It's a great book on tape for those of you who don't like to read actual words on paper. It's great. And so it explains exactly why this is necessary. He spends a lot of time talking about mouth breathing. And I decided I was going to just get this, tape my mouth, and then, get into a parasympathetic state, meditate and relax, and release this idea that I was going to wake up and feel like shit. I just released that and said, no, it doesn't need to be that way. And by the way, I've every single time I've fallen asleep in a musty hotel room, I wake up feeling like bus hit me. I got bags under my eyes and I didn't sleep, night terrors, the whole thing. And I woke up in the morning and I felt fine. And then they moved me to another room because I actually sent them a note and said, hey, I got a mold problem in my room. They're like, how do you know? I'm like, do you see my record there? But like, do you see my email address? They're like, Jason at got mold. They're like, oh, okay. So what would you like us to do? Can you move me to another room that has a mold problem? That would be like first, but I got to go. So I can't like go find it with you, can you? So I checked out and then they moved me back into another room and it was just as moldy. So I ended up spending 3 days in a moldy room because, Austin was packed with the crypto conference and Back Your Health. And so, but I did the same thing every night. And I found that I was able to, I didn't spend, I went in there to sleep and that was it. But I did not have any of the problems. And I attribute it to the practice of acceptance and getting back into the parasympathetic state. So the physiological aspect of it is there's a psychophysiological aspect to this. It's very strong. And so I'm going to circle back. Air, food, and attitude. Air, chemicals and mold. Food. Mycotoxins are in your food, by the way. Yeah. It's where all these mycotoxin urine panels are actually informing what our mycotoxin urine panels are actually informing us about is the mycotoxins in our food, which is mostly derived from international imported grains, nuts, seeds, spices, coffee, tea, you name it, all that kind of stuff, as well as things like tomato sauce. Where do they throw those ugly tomatoes that they don't want to put on the shelf? So how about peanut butter? I love peanut butter, but all these nut butters and stuff like that are notorious, especially the organic ones, because they're not using fungicides on them. And so I'm probably loaded with, in fact, I know I've got aflatoxins because I eat a lot of peanut butter. And then also conventional meats and dairy is a carryover effect. So anytime you've got these animals that are being fed things that they shouldn't be eating, like corn and grains and stuff like that, oftentimes they're being stored, the grains are stored in suboptimal facilities, or stuff that was human grade that's no longer allowed to be sold, that gets fed. So then guess what? That rolls up to us the same way mercury does, in the ocean. And so we end up with this carryover effect that accumulates in our tissues. And these things are hydrophobic, so they don't excrete well. They are lipophilic, so they stick in your fat cells, and they're heat resistant, so you can't cook them out. So the solution to that is essentially a ketogenic diet with grass-fed, pastured meats only, no conventional stuff, and it's very restrictive. But what happens is it reduces all of the effects of mycotoxins on your major organ systems and your gut, your intestinal permeability. Kidney disease. The guy who recruited me from the gas station is got late stage kidney disease now, and he drinks a lot of shitty coffee, and it's probably from ochratoxin A, which is attacks the kidneys, and so these things do have a very potent effect on us, and this is well established in veterinary medicine. They don't test humans on this stuff because same reason I talked about earlier, that's unethical, but the data from veterinary medicine is very clear that mycotoxins have a serious impact on our health, and that is we're being exposed to mycotoxins in our food, not in our air. This is a really important point. People are all freaking out about mycotoxins in the air. They don't become airborne easily the way people think about them. When mold grows, and this is not a segue, this is a circle back. When mold grows, it produces three things. It's spores, mycotoxins, and microbial gases, the MVOCs. Spores are physical seed-like capsules that are essentially they go forth and prosper. They carry some, if they're mycotoxin producing, they may carry some mycotoxins, but very small amounts. And they are generally irritants, allergens. So not responsible for lots of diseases, although they can be infectious for people that have a compromised immune system. So they can, very specific species can be pathogenic. Rare, but still not to be ignored. The mycotoxins, which is what everybody talks about, are actually a very small percentage of the known molds. So about 100 out of 100,000 species are known to produce mycotoxins. So it's a very small number. And even if you were to say of the 1,000 or so that are commonly found indoors, it's like 10% or less of produces mycotoxins. And even those only produce them intermittently. And the science on this shows, and the research, and there's a lot of research on this, shows that they don't produce them in buildings very much because the building materials don't have enough nutrition in them. And so the dust that mold grows on and the paper that mold grows on doesn't support fungal growth the way it does in a grain silo where there's nothing but nutrition. And so that's why we see a lot of the mycotoxin production in food, but we don't find it in our buildings. So if you grow them on a petri dish, you grow them in a laboratory where there's a lot of nutrition, boy, you can find a lot of toxin production. But that's just not the way it works in buildings. And we also have a very comfortable environment. Mycotoxin production is generally amplified by extreme temperature swings, interestingly. So cold, hot. The stress actually causes these fungi to produce mycotoxins. And so we don't have that. We live a very comfortable environment, 70 degrees. And, we generally, so mycotoxin production. And in order for them to become airborne, they're crystalline substances when they're fully dried. So they have to actually they have to be disturbed, or when they're wet and sticky, when they're still in sort of a liquid state, they're on the material, they're on the spores, they're on the dust. And so they have to be disturbed and in large amounts. And I have been in situations where the evidence was that the mycotoxins were significant enough to cause specific symptoms, but the vast majority, and when I say the vast majority, I'm talking 95% or more of these cases where people are saying I've got mycotoxins, 99% maybe, it's really it's that extreme, is probably almost all from food. That's not saying that mold's not making you sick. So that's jumping into the third piece is microbial gases, okay? Musty smell, long considered an aesthetic nuisance. Just this thing, grandma's basement, no big deal. I'm here to tell you that it is probably the big deal. So commonly symptoms associated with microbial, the musty smell, the same smell in my hotel room and the one that everyone that triggers a flight or flight response for people that are already sensitized, right? So you end up in that cell danger thing, right? That's the correlation between the musty smell and the chemical exposures. It's all gases. And so the musty smell is essentially mold burps, mold farts, actually, more crudely. It's the digestive byproduct of mold growth. So it's digesting what it's growing on and it's releasing these gases into the air.
And that's the musty smell.
And that's the musty smell. So it is the sign of active mold growth. It's a metabolism. It's a primary, so it is a byproduct of mold growth. And so it is the first sign of mold growth, but it is also a health hazard. So circling back to my mom when I was, her untimely demise in 2008 rather, Brown University did a rather large study, 6,000 people, and they asked them basically, do you have any mold or moisture problems in your home? And past or present. And then how are you feeling? So they did a quality of life questionnaire. And what they found was a very strong correlation between mold and dampness indoors and depression. Now they stopped short of saying that the mold caused the depression because that wasn't the purpose of the study. But what they did ask, was it due to disempowerment? People saying I have a mold problem, but I haven't fixed it yet. That's pretty, usually that's a kind of, the conditions surrounding that might be depressing. I don't own the place. My boss, my husband, my wife, whatever, they're not doing anything. And those people tend to be spending more time indoors. And, so, there's a lot of reasons why that would be potentially linked. However, subsequent to that, in 2015, Dr. Joan Bennett, a good friend of mine at Rutgers University, she ended up with a mold problem of her own. She's a mold researcher, fungal geneticist. She ended up with a mold problem of her own. She had a house in New Orleans when Katrina came through.
Oh boy!
Flooded her house.
Oh.
She went down to investigate afterwards. Brought a bunch of sampling equipment because she's curious scientist, and she was in the building with a respirator on, but just an N95. Right, just the one that takes particles out, and the musty smell was coming through, and she was getting sick. She had to leave the building a few times, and eventually stopped her exercise, or stopped her inspection, if you will, prematurely, and was shocked by how ill she felt knowing she'd protected herself from the spores and the potential mycotoxins they might be
Mhm.
carrying. So she thought, what is going on here? Because this is something that I have not researched. And, she's a mycotoxin expert. She's a fungal geneticist. This is what she does. And so she came back to the lab and began studying the musty smell and what's in it. And she found that some of the most common constituents, because it's a potpourri. So there's different chemicals that are produced at different metabolic stages and depending upon what the mold's growing on and what
Mhm.
species and things like that. But one of the most common elements is this thing called 1-octanthreol or mushroom alcohol. And it's got a very distinctive sort of musty smell. It's one of the musty notes, if you will, in the profile. And she began testing fruit flies and some plants and some different basic science experiments. And she found the plants didn't do very well, which was interesting. But she also found that the fruit flies that are especially genetically engineered to fluoresce when they produce dopamine, they stopped producing dopamine. They stopped reproducing. They started flying down instead to the light. They began developing a locomotor disorder, like
Yeah.
Parkinsonian-like symptoms is the way she described it. And
Huge
essentially
dopamine hits.
neurotoxicity. She found it to be neurotoxic.
Wow.
And so she also found that it was 40 times more toxic than toluene, which is one of the most carcinogenic substances known to man. And so she essentially said, that we should not dismiss this as just a microbial VOC. Uh, this is not classified as a toxin, but it's clearly a toxin because we call them mycotoxins, but to the exclusion of these other toxins that are produced by myco or mold. And so she proposed that they be called now volatoxins. And so
Mhm.
volatile and toxin combined. So she coined the new term. And so I've been working with her to bring some of that research forward. We're working on a blood test actually for the microbial volatile organic compounds
Oh,
for mold exposure because they're right now people are taking these mycotoxin panels, scaring the shit out of themselves, and then they're going and doing an inspection using ERMI because the unscrupulous characters that do that love to piggyback on the momentum of the fear that's
course,
induced
the
by a
fear.
mycotoxin panel. Next thing you know, they got $100,000 remediation out of it, whether there's a mold problem or not. And these people are not getting any better as a result because
Mm-mm.
they're being completely, taken advantage of. So, you garbage in, garbage out. If you want to misinterpret the data, boy, you can paint a picture whatever you want it to look like. So it's a real problem.
Hey everyone, this was such a good episode and chock full of information that we decided to break it into 2 parts. So come back next week for part 2, where Jason and I continue talking about mold testing, air, food, attitude, and what you can do to get your house and your body healthy again. Thank you for tuning into my podcast. If you enjoyed this week's episode, I'd love for you to share it with someone who'd find the information useful. Please leave a review anywhere you listen to podcasts, and it'll help the information get out to others. If you're interested in seeing if we're a great fit to work together, the link is in the show notes below where you can sign up for a free consultation with me. So go make it a great day and let your authentic self shine.